Once upon a time, a long time ago, a cozy cottage nestled near a forest, filled with sweet-smelling flowers, friendly animals, and some that were not so friendly. In the cottage lived a mother and her little girl who always wore a red cape with a hood.
We've all been brought up on fairy tales. For many of us, they're what we first think of when someone asks us to tell them a story. What you might not have considered is that they are always told in a very structured way, and that's because children respond best to linear storytelling. Fairy tales, if you think about it, all start with the same line, once upon a time, and they all end with the same line too, happily ever after. And in between, the narrative is usually told entirely chronologically, with some rise and fall, some mild peril, even an evil stepmother or two. In Little Red Riding Hood's case, we progress from an innocent walk in the woods, a meeting with a dubious whiskery fellow, a visit to Grandma's cottage, and then, depending on how age-appropriate you want to be, total carnage involving a woodcutter and an axe.
The wolf sprang from the bed. Round and round the bed he chased her.
What a commotion! It's the wolf!
Who opened the door?
You terrible wolf! What have you done? You'll do no more!
With one blow of his mighty axe, he destroyed the wolf and freed Grandmother.
Now, compare that approach to journalism. Pick up any newspaper, read an article online, and what you'll find is that they almost always start with the climax of the story, the critical moment. It's emblazoned in the headline of every article, every strapline, and by the end of the first paragraph, you'll probably know exactly what's happened. Try it and you'll see. The media will always begin with the carnage in the cottage, and not the little girl skipping through the forest dreaming of a picnic with Granny. Those pesky journalists say they love a spoiler. It might sound counterintuitive, but this idea of ruining the end of a story right at the beginning actually makes a lot of sense if time is a factor. It's like a 999 call. If your house is on fire, you don't waste time telling the operator you're once upon a time. This is not the moment for backstory or scene setting. Instead, you tell them the basic facts as quickly as you can. What's happening? Where? Who's involved? And only then might you provide some background information when you're confident that the fire engine is already on its way. And press releases are exactly the same. In the fast-paced world of journalism, you don't have the luxury of sitting back and gathering your readers around your armchair. It's all about context. Storytelling is not just about the content of your story, it's about the order you tell it in. And with a press release, you have to cut to the chase. Fast. I'm Tom Clark, and this is The Perfect Press Release, a podcast that will help you make your press releases stand out above the rest. This is episode 2, Once Upon a Time. The best stories build momentum, and a well-told story is memorable, right? It stays with the reader long after the first telling. And because of that, there are many elements of storytelling that you can take into your press releases, but not all of them. And in my experience, this idea of linear storytelling, that's the fairy tale method, is the thing that most would-be press release writers get wrong. And funnily enough, it's the best writers that tend to make the biggest mistakes. They're so keen to flex their creative muscles, they waste crucial time setting the scene, telling their yawning readers all about their company's pre-war origins and their founders' awe-inspiring journey from rags to riches. Now, in PR and marketing, that's not always a bad thing. Spinning a narrative arc into company stories can work well for a website post or a company blog. But press releases are different. They are not company stories, they are news stories. And telling your audience something they've not heard before will make them much more likely to sit up and take notice.
The best press releases teach the reader something new, right? It's about teaching is a good word there, right? So you're presenting information or data even, and in the case that I'm thinking of, it was a data-based story. where you're highlighting or unveiling or revealing something that couldn't possibly have been known before. And that really piques people's interests, if it's an interesting topic.
That's Duncan McKean, a veteran of PR in the technology industry. His press releases have helped clients gain huge amounts of media interest by tapping into conversations that are already happening. And we call this hooking. It's a great way of getting your story noticed, even if you're a small organisation that nobody's heard of yet. And several years ago, Duncan and his team were working with just such a client on PR for a study on mobile data usage. What could have been, let's face it, a pretty dry story that died before it could make a ripple, was elevated simply by the brand they chose to use for the study.
iPhones are all the rage, and it just happened that that's where we did the study. We could have done it on Samsung devices, we could have done the study on Nokia devices. We chose to do it on iPhones because they were topical, and the choice of iPhone as a topical device in itself, it was still back in the days when people would queue round the block outside the Apple store for an iPhone. The fact that it was Apple itself was really, really interesting, and in particular, painted Apple users as these very hip, advanced people that are capable of using this device to get access to all kinds of rich multimedia technology. And the phone did ring off the hook. We had, bucket loads of coverage, literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces. And we had phone calls from Bloomberg, CNBC. I think we were on BBC World, and the CTO was pretty much on back-to-back broadcast calls at the end of that day. What started with a few trade publications in the morning snowballed into global media by the end of the day. It was quite something. And that particular news announcement ultimately we built on, but ultimately resulted in the profile and prominence of that company being raised to the point where it was acquired.
So, hooking your press release to a trending topic can be a great way of generating media interest. But you have to be careful. If your story is too elaborate or complicated, or if it takes forever to tell, then people will lose interest. Most of the time, journalists don't know you or your company. They certainly don't owe you anything. You need them a lot more than they need you. One good tip: you're much better coming up with small, bite-sized ideas than trying to churn out fully formed stories. Give the journalist a kicking off point, get them interested, but allow them the freedom to move the story on. When I spoke to journalist Lauren Potts last year, she gave a great example of how a press release can pique the interest of the media without overstepping the mark.
So yeah, I've actually got a good press release. It came in my inbox yesterday, which was very fortunate. I don't know how this PR knew that I was working on content for the King's coronation. Maybe they looked out, maybe they saw me tweeting about it, I don't know. But they managed to target potentially the right person, so big tick straight away. The next thing about it was it had a really good subject line. So it was rare 86-year-old coronation ale to be auctioned for charity. Fine, nothing wrong with that. They gave a subhead which was a bit feistier, like a bit more tabloid perhaps. Unearthed relic from abandoned coronation to be auctioned, which I quite liked. And that was followed by a bullet point saying which coronation it was, when they'll be auctioned, where proceeds were going. So interest suitably piqued. And broadly speaking, it answered the major questions. And this is the thing that PRs need to understand. And it's not that hard. We want to know who, what, when, why, how. And this press release wasn't perfect because I had to ask the where question. It didn't say where. But there was enough in there for me to envisage a story and why it might appeal to readers beyond location. Because people love a story where something's been discovered. There's interest in the coronation. People like beer. So they provided all the things that I needed. They also provided video. So moving images is a bit more unusual to get in a press release, but they also had stills as well. And it all just went a really long way to making my life easy. And if you do that, it's much more likely to get published.
In the case of the King's coronation, it was about tapping into that ready-made media interest in a national topic, putting your own unique spin on it. And that can work well both in the good times and also the bad. You just need to know what the media is talking about at any given moment. Andrew Woodall works for a PR software company that helps clients distribute press releases.
A lot of PR is actually crisis management rather than making announcements about new things. We were actually quite fortunate during 2020 actually that we saw our services more in demand because there was obviously a worldwide pandemic going on, and journalists were really hungry for information from all sorts of companies about what they were doing about the pandemic, about working from home, about vaccines, etc. Or you know, we all lived through it. We all know what was going on, and almost every company had something to say about their crisis management. So that's a really important point to make, I think, is if you're not talking about your company, then other people might be doing that talking, and a press release is a really good way of kind of making sure you take control of the conversation.
Of course, stories can span fact and fiction. You might feel tempted to add a little creative accounting to your press releases. But in a world where everyone is sceptical of the news they read, particularly from sources they've not heard of, press releases are not really the place to start playing fast and loose with the truth.
I was doing a little bit of preparation for this chat and found out that April Fool's Day is known as the worst day on the internet. There's a couple of examples that I found recently where Volkswagen were sending out a press release that they're changing their name to Volkswagen with a T to
because that's what everyone thinks it is anyway.
Yeah. To refer to their commitment to become electric vehicles only in the future. And the Associated Press actually made strenuous efforts to check that this was a genuine story and were assured by Volkswagen that it was. But it ultimately transpired that it wasn't, and nobody was amused really, and it did affect their share price when they made the announcement. So they got into all sorts of trouble with the SEC, etc. And then another example was a company that sent out a press release saying they were going to start making bacon-flavoured mouthwash. And they actually ended up receiving customer complaints because it turned out to be an April Fool, and people actually did want bacon-flavoured mouthwash. So there's some great examples of April Fools that I've seen generally out there in the media, but just because of the position the newswire services have in that they're supposed to be sending verified, trusted content to the media, they don't really like them.
Bacon-flavoured mouthwash. In all seriousness though, facts and truth, they're more important than ever. If you're going to be successful in the long run with your press releases, you have to be seen as an authority. You have to be credible. Even if you're not actually lying, but merely being playful or ambiguous, it can do real harm to your reputation.
Providing basic facts is just, press release 101, isn't it? I think offering case studies from, bona fide people, I think that's a really good way. Experts. For example, the ale press release that I got the other day, and I talked about that earlier, they actually used a really good expert, a really well-known royal correspondent, and I tried to get her for a piece that I was writing and couldn't get her. So I actually did think, well, they did really well to get her to comment on this piece, because I saw her name and I was like, I know that she's trustworthy. So getting the right people to give you the right quotes, I think is really important. And I think making those quotes useful and not adding jargon and using language that's a bit vague, I think that's really important, because I think if you're using language that's only used in your client's world, that can work for niche or trade publications, but because that audience will get it. But if you're pitching to like a consumer or more general audience, it's going to sound a bit stilted and come off a bit untrustworthy somehow. It's like, what are you hiding by not speaking in a normal way? I think if people don't understand the words that you're saying, then the message just isn't going to get across.
Lauren's point about jargon there is really interesting. In my experience, there are two things that get the press release purists' knickers in a twist. One is jargon, and the other is cliché. You know the kind of thing. Those lazy terms you see plastered all over marketing material to make a company's products stand out above the rest. Everything is always innovative or game-changing or even disruptive. The purists hate that. You jump on LinkedIn and you'll be sure to be inundated with posts that say you must eliminate jargon from your marketing material. You're never more than a moment away from a blog titled 5 cliches to immediately ditch from your copywriting vocabulary. Now, I'm actually going to say something here that might be slightly controversial. Whisper it quietly, but I believe technical jargon and copywriting cliches in a press release can be acceptable, but only if they are used sparingly and responsibly. Let's look at cliche first. Just because a word is overused, it shouldn't make it completely prohibited. Cliches are cliches for a reason, right? They ring true with people. And remember, you are not writing your press release to impress the grammar Nazis over on LinkedIn. You are writing it to attract people to your story. And if you're issuing blanket bans on words and phrases, that can be really prescriptive and damaging. So, I believe you can be delighted to announce something. Your products can be innovative, game-changing, or even disruptive. But, and it is a crucial but, only if those terms are genuinely appropriate and you can tell your reader why. It's the same with jargon. Littering your press release with very technical language can be extremely detrimental if you're writing for a consumer audience. But if you're writing for an audience of very technical journalists, you will be quite literally speaking their language.
I think you have to understand what it is that you're trying to help your client do, right? That's step number one. Are you trying to sell more stuff? Or are you trying to demonstrate the value that the company has to potentially attract investors, for instance? So the two different purposes, two different outcomes eventually of you'll never solve it all with a single press release, by the way. But still, there has to be a purpose behind the press release. Why are you doing it? And based on that, then you then have a look and think about who is the audience for that press release. If it's people in your existing business world, then you can talk in the esoteric a little bit more and a bit more of the technical detail because you expect them to understand it.
Now, there's one final thing about storytelling, and I'm not sure I'm the best person to deliver this news given my penchant for verbosity, but the biggest tip I can give you is learn the gift of writing short. In press releases, less really is more. The whole thing should not nudge much over 500 words. Your sentences should be short and pithy. Each sentence should say one thing rather than trying to express multiple ideas. Paragraphs should be between 1 to 2, maybe 3 sentences max, or your reader will quickly lose interest in a sea of words. This is not War and Peace, after all. So, what have we learned about storytelling in press releases? Well, when you're drafting your release, think about Little Red Riding Hood. Write your story like a scoop, with the key points and the killer lines right at the beginning. A press release should not be a classic tale for the ages. It's only valuable if you are telling the reader something new. And finally, you should always try to hook your story to a trending topic, something that's already being talked about. Next week, we're going to get stuck into the practical side of press releases. We're going to sort the subheadlines from the quotes and the datelines from the boilerplates. It's time to dig into the press release template. Until then, thanks for listening. The Perfect Press Release is written and produced by me, Tom Clark. Editing is by Jay Vydelingum at Clement Stories. If you'd like any help with writing your next press release, or if you want to book a free press release consultation, you can connect with me on LinkedIn or through my website. The details are in the show notes. And on a completely different note, I'm also working on a new true crime podcast because, well, who isn't these days? I'm on the lookout for interesting, offbeat, historical crime stories. The more intriguing, the better. Maybe you have an unsolved mystery in your local village, or a nefarious great uncle who was always in trouble with the law. If you have any ideas, please get in touch. Thanks for listening.